Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day, greetings, and might I add a side of a helping. Welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Wadi, and thank you for joining me today. There's one person that is missing, Russ, but hopefully we can fill in with some audience members today because today is an interesting episode. It is the beginning of our October series where we start to get a little bit spooky with things. So why not go at it alone a little bit, right? If you notice the theme of today that's baked into the title, 10 billion points to you. But first, let me reintroduce myself because I'm Tristan Wani. I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And as always, we always like to say a hello, but also ask, where's everybody tuning in from? Where's everybody dialing in from? Where's everybody watching, listening, or anything in between? And as always, we also have a nice little question that goes along with it, which I will pose to the audience. First, as I say hello to producer Jeff, and hello to everybody else joining in, like Ari. Thank you. So the question that we're going to go with today, in continuing with our theme, is going to be based on the or. What do I mean by that? Outside of the Boolean logic piece is, would you rather speak every language fluently, but only in writing, or speak only your native language, but be impossibly persuasive in it? So feel free to put in the chat kind of what you're thinking. But I'll explain kind of where I'm going with this, because I would pick along the lines of I would have to speak the native language, because I feel like option one we kind of have with generative AI, where you can kind of speak through your phone and just generate everything, right? But option two, being able to speak and communicate in a persuasive manner, that's interesting, because there's a couple of states, a couple of locations, a couple of ways that I would like to order off the fast food menu that would help to be a little bit more persuasive. But as Ari says, speak, native language. Ari sees where I'm kind of going with this, because there's some everyday tasks that you would like to kind of, have a little bit more powers of persuasion in, especially when it comes to maybe taking a car to the mechanic, right? Being at a restaurant, or just explaining why you got the certain gift for your significant other. But I digress, because we're going to jump into a fun title, a fun show. So hopefully we can kind of keep this theme going of adventuring into the fog. And what is that fog? Well, stay tuned, because we first have to tell you where we kind of came from. And that is, audit season is coming. That was our episode last week. And essentially what we drilled into is identifying, hey, what are the potential items you have to look out for when you have audits? Pick your flavor, your variety, PCI, HIPAA, compliance, internal, external, could be all of the above. And that kind of led us to kind of double click, dive in to today's topic, where, hey, maybe I am new to the AWS cloud. Maybe I'm a little bit scared, right? Because the fog is scary. Because why? You can't see the other side. And sometimes when you're trying to learn and pick up on different items, delving into the unknown is part of it. So that's where today's title comes from. And where are we going? Well, let's see how we can clear out some of the fog. How can we demystify these different components? Well, we have a couple of tools, and it's right there in the title. If you want to start with something, a key piece outside of the identity piece is just thinking about, hey, what are the potential threats that can be lurking out there, right? That's kind of usually why people are afraid of not being able to see. Well, something like GuardDuty will help you to have that intelligent threat detection service that can continuously monitor your environment. It could be your eyes in that fog to clear up a couple of items, right? Because it analyzes couple billions, I would say 10 billions, just because I like to say that phrase, of events across multiple data sources, whether it be VPC flow log, CloudTrail, event logs, DNS logs, everything in between that. So where we start to go with it is, hey, in the traditional type of security tools, you required a lot of setup and rule management, things like that. But GuardDuty is that managed services that kind of helps to cut out some of those pieces. So that helps to demystify, which we'll jump into. But we also have to understand how do exactly we implement. That's, I think, a key component of this, because GuardDuty implementation is, let's say, a lot easier to understand once you have an idea of how AWS handles secure architecture, right? So spoilers for later, and just talking about the SRA. And what is the SRA? Stay tuned, and I'll kind of spell it out for you. Or if somebody wants to spell out in the chat, spoilers to you, but feel free to do so. Because what we're trying to figure out is, hey, if I have a multi-account setup and I'm trying to clear out some of this fog, how do I implement something like GuardDuty? How do I handle all these various VPC flow logs, DNS logs, and everything so that things clear up a little bit? And then I want to get to the point where, hey, can I read the signs? Can I interpret the GuardDuty findings a certain way that it helps to benefit me? Well, what is that benefit? It's being able to say, hey, this is a high alert, this is a medium alert, this is a low alert, and kind of organizing it appropriately. I want to, part of my heart of hearts wants to go into something like SIM optimization, but we're taking the crawl step. We're taking a little bit of the walk step. And if we want to run, we'll run in a later episode, because what we're trying to do is just understand what are the basic tactics we can arm ourselves with. How can we respond to findings that require a little bit of a balanced approach? As a certain, I would say, comic book villain says, how do we bring a balance to everything? How do we minimize the security exposure and kind of limit the operational disruption, as I know stakeholders like to do? So these are all pieces of the puzzle that we want to jump in. But I think the spoilers I would first go into is starting out exactly where I said, with what do we have to understand from a security reference architectural standpoint? And with that key consideration, let's jump right into that. So one of the items that we're looking at is the security reference architecture. So you may say, hey, what is this? Well, essentially, this is the foundations of where you go to understanding what are the key components that I need to set up when I have maybe a multi-account environment. So if we were to enhance a little bit more, we'll kind of dig into this a little bit. So let us add this into the screen right here and kind of carry forward with it, right? Enhance. So when you look at the organizational structure, you notice you have multiple OUs. You have your infrastructure, you have your workloads, and each of these components has a number of different AWS services within it. So where do I start? Well, if we're thinking of security OU tooling, well, why don't we just start here? And essentially, you kind of see where this comes into play, because when you start to understand, okay, I have these 10 or so services, what do I really need to know in here? Well, we're talking about GuardDuty, but how does GuardDuty integrate with something like Security Hub? That's a key component, a key piece of what we're trying to figure out. Because when you're thinking of, hey, what is the most exciting tool within my AWS, I was going to say tool bucket, but the toolbox. Tool bucket is what happens when the toolbox is overfilled. If you ever notice, your tools never fit in one box. They always have to kind of grow from there, because you keep buying the same one about 8 times. But maybe that's a me problem, but it's the same concept. You want to understand and have everything organized in such a manner that it's easy to kind of pick apart to say, do we have this on or off within our environment? And when you think of the one tool that makes you most excited, you think of, if we were in the fog, is it a flashlight? Is it a radio? Is it a map? Is it a first aid kit? Or maybe it's something to defend yourself, like a knife or something along those lines. And if we were to attribute those different items, a flashlight could be something like VPC flow logs. The radio can be something like CloudTrail, event monitoring. The map can be DNS queries. And we could go on and on with this analogy. But it depends on what is important to you within your organization. But it also depends on how you go about setting up your environment. So if you follow the security reference architecture, or SRA, now you start to think about things a little bit differently, right? Because you have the dedicated account for security tooling. And this doesn't just have to be AWS specific items. You can also have third-party partners within your tooling account, right? Maybe you have a third-party SIM or something along those lines. But the way to think about the security tooling account is, this is how we support a defense in depth organizational strategy, by making sure that we break everything down to the ones and zeros. And what I mean by the ones and zeros, well, this looking is that's scary. This is the fog part, right? When you start to look at it, you don't know where exactly to look, especially when you're first starting out, because it starts to get a little bit overwhelming. But if you break things down a little bit into bite size of, okay, we have the security tooling account. If we have something like GuardDuty, if we have something like Security Hub, now we start to think of logs. Where are those logs going? Maybe they're going into our logging account or our logging archiving account, right? Where you have that centralized bucket of logs. And since we're already off the rails, when you think of the centralized logging account and you have all your logs in here, a lot of our customers, what we'll see is, hey, maybe we'll take this, since all the logs are being gathered in here, and we think of a way in order to triage this within our TDIR or our threat detection incident response workflow, right? Maybe we have this hooked into a third-party SIM, for example, and then we would use SNS or SNS topics to dump these items into, or directly into, something like a CrowdStrike or a Splunk or something along those lines, right? But the key aspect is, before we can get here, we have to understand what's populating this. And this is where we go to understanding that fog component is, hey, if we leverage GuardDuty, that might be a starting point to kind of going through, right? And as we mentioned, GuardDuty is that cornerstone of your threat detection platform. So if we start to think of it that way, you think of, hey, if I understand the cornerstone, it's like building a puzzle. Start at the corners. If you can start in the middle, 10 million points to you. But starting at the corner is a good place to start. So if you have your threat detection, and then you have your identity, right? You have your logging mechanism, right? You start to paint in the picture which is your target state security strategy. And you start to get to a point where you understand how these different services are different. Right? These little things, they matter. Because if you have, let's say, GuardDuty within your environment, you can focus on the threat detection aspects. Now, you may ask yourself, okay, if I am new to the AWS, if I'm trying to understand some of the tactics, well, the first part is understanding what tools you have. So if you have WAF or security groups and GuardDuty, what's the difference between all of those, right? So those kind of things help you to understand how to build up your defense in depth strategy. And then where do we go from there? Well, we start to think about items in a different way. You start to think of, okay, I know the differences, but now how do they integrate? How do these puzzle pieces fit together? Because if I have something like Inspector as another service, which performs vulnerability assessments on specific resources, GuardDuty unlike inspector, monitors the account-wide activities for the malicious behavior, right? And then CloudTrail and GuardDuty. CloudTrail, GuardDuty essentially, I would say, synthesizes, I think that's the word to use, the multiple data sources in order to identify the actual security threat. So you start to see how all these are integrated. And you start to think of the different ways that you can piece together the entire picture. And the last piece I would mention in this particular area is how you get to a point of knowing what's malicious and what's not. And a lot of the uplift, the heavy lifting, the work, GuardDuty already does. It maintains that extensive and continuously updated database of IP addresses that might be malicious, things of that nature. The item that you want to have in place is making sure you have the mechanisms to say, this is good and this is bad from my environment standpoint, right? Because there might be items that you configure that GuardDuty is alerting to that may be some type of custom item, or maybe it's not the way it's supposed to be, where it's a little bit over leveraged. And what I mean by over leveraged, I mean the configuration doesn't look like how it's supposed to, or that you envisioned, and you need a little bit of help of tweaking. And that's where you start out with. That's the benefit of leveraging some of the services like GuardDuty. So part of the equation is getting to that point. The other part is, all right, how do I implement this? Because that's usually where we go, is I have a structure, I have a framework, I have something that I just want to try out. Well, you think of your traditional security tools. You think of, okay, now I know a little bit of GuardDuty. Now I can get to implementing. So the key pieces for implementation is figuring out, hey, what's a simple way to deploy this? Well, you can go through the console and just manually click and you're done. It's open, it's up and running. You can even generate some alerts just to test out the service. You can also say hello to Red Eye and thank you everybody for joining in, right? The other piece of this is getting to a point where you say, maybe I'll use IAC. I think that's a good place to start. So a simple way to do this, an efficient way to do this, is starting out with maybe a simple YAML, right? If we have our simple YAML set up, which we will show and populate right here, you start to get to a point of understanding, okay, there's a lot that can go into this, right? Let me resize a little bit. So when we look at, all right, here's an automated deployment for our episode 33. I wanted to call out 33 just for a certain game of the same variety. If we have something like a YAML that we can leverage within our environment, it helps us to just kind of break things down into the ones and zeros. And what do I mean by the ones and zeros? Everything I keep saying. So essentially we have a GuardDuty template here that we randomly created and generated, right, to kind of think about this, where you have something that defines the CloudFormation version. It goes through the usual steps. Hey, you must have an email address that must be valid, right? So security team at example.com is the piece that we're using today. But one of the things I wanted to call out is if you have the YAML and you're using your IDE of your choice, you can start to go through with steps like this of, hey, what does this visually look like? And it's a neat little feature where you can start to think about, hey, from a high level, this is what my template looks like. This is how it's designed, right? So you have a couple of GuardDuty detectors and event rules and things of that nature. So let's bounce between the two. So when you have your silent fog environment, right? You start to think of, okay, did I do the first item of configuring, hey, what is the default publishing frequency? 15 minutes, standard, typical piece to go by, right? But essentially where we're going to with the detector is we have something within our main template that gets to a point where we have maybe our VPC flow logs, we have our CloudTrail events, we have our DNS logs, we have our S3, our Kubernetes, all these different items that are able to go through and be detected, right? And if we're detecting all these items, what we want to eventually get to is, hey, how do we alert on that piece? So we have an SNS topic to essentially do that exact function, right? So this creates a notification channel for our GuardDuty findings. And we always want to make sure that we're taking the proper security mechanisms like encryption. I say encryption and encryption a couple of times for the other people on the other side of the internet. Just like identity, it's very important, right? So we get to that point where we are doing that. And then eventually we get to the point as well of just understanding, hey, how do we filter? How do we understand what's a high finding? What's a low finding? What's a medium finding? Well, these are the items that you want to think about based on your environment, your configurations. That's all pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to go through and understand. So within this template, if we visualize it a little bit more, we have our GuardDuty detector that's picking up from all these different areas. We have our encryption key for our SNS topic, and we have our security alerts that are generated based on this. So it's simple from that aspect, but it's just like how we created this is we want to make sure that we're breaking things down to bits and bytes that we understand. So within using something like this, it makes it a little bit easier to say, all right, all of this code that we just created to define our detector, our alerting mechanism, our subscription, our SNS topics, we can get to that part where we have a simple deployment of GuardDuty in a cloud formation that can be repeatable within our organization. Now, eventually what you can do is you can have this YAML file set up in such a manner that you can deploy it via a pipeline. And the pipeline deployment we can get into at another day, let's say, a side quest that helps us to break down things a little bit more, right? So these are the interesting things that we get into. But I think the other piece of this is taking the step back, as we like to do, and think about it. Is we had that GuardDuty detector. We figured out a way to publish an alert. But now what we have to get to is an understanding of the next steps. That's the key thing, right? Is we have the alerts. We have GuardDuty running within the environment. It's pulling in the different pieces. It's doing its thing. Well, how do we continuously update that? How do we refine that? Because that's usually the next step. Because maybe you have it enabled and you start to get 1 alert, 2 alerts, 3 alerts, 4 alerts, and it keeps going on. Well, there's suppression rules that you can leverage within GuardDuty to kind of quiet down some of the noisy alerts that are generated, because maybe you're building up your environment. You need some suppression because maybe there's a vulnerability scan happening. Maybe it's a pen test happening. Maybe there's something else that's generating similar patterns. So there's different mechanisms that you can use. And some of those mechanisms, which I will say with enthusiasm, tagging, resource tags are an important thing. And we can go on a whole episode rant on why those are important. But the key pieces to understand is you want to make sure that you break things down to understanding every piece of your environment and tagging appropriately, documenting appropriately for everybody who might come after. And yes, that is a reference to a certain game on episode 33 for those who come after. But understanding the boundaries when it comes to the scope of GuardDuty, how it's leveraged within your environment, and kind of understanding how it integrates with AWS organizations is important, right? When you have GuardDuty, you can have a delegated administrator that can give you the visibility in respects to the different OUs within your overall AWS organization, which is a very important part of the puzzle. But I think the way to understand this, to visualize this a little bit more, is to kind of take that step back and to think about it in a certain way. And what way is that? Well, it's to think of maybe some of the past legends, past stories. And that's where we get into our normal section, as SideQuest legend has it. And this is the part of our show where we delve into a customer story a little bit deeper until we get to a point of just understanding, hey, how can I learn from this and apply it to my own target state security strategy? Well, let's dive right into our story. Well, I say 3 wells because I think we have to have our SideQuest board as well. So what I do there or didn't do there. So let's take that step back a little bit closer, a little bit further. I think right here works. So when we think of the SideQuest board, it's a visualization of our customer story. So we're getting to a point of understanding, hey, how do we take this to the next step? How do we understand what terrifies us when it comes to thinking about our environment? Well, let's listen to a customer story where, let's say we had Sandwich Cloud Corp, right? Where maybe they're a mysterious enterprise operating in the realm of AWS. And mysterious and sandwich, maybe it's mystery sandwiches. But maybe they struggle to identify the invisible threats that are lurking within their infrastructure. How do they operate in multiple AWS regions where maybe each division kind of wanders a little bit blindly with their own threat detection approaches, since maybe there's a hands-off security approach. Maybe the security team gives a little bit more than they should have permissions, access, thought process. And that could lead to some gaps of, I would say, the horrifying variety just because of the month we're in, but also leads to opportunities for education. Because in this customer example, they have, let's say, a glimmer of light within the fog. Because when a recent security incident happened, they got to a point where they thought about it, to the point where they said, mystery sandwich. Thank you for that, Ari. Of, hey, getting to the point of understanding their blind spots. Because once you have the light illuminating, you can kind of see some things, but you can't see the others. And that kind of leads into the question I posed to the chat, and anybody who's willing to listen is, what terrifies you most in the cloud fog? And that's kind of where you get to the point of thinking, is it the invisible threats? Is it the dark corners? Is it the unknown entities? When you just take that pause and you kind of hear a certain kind of call in the background that may sound a little bit ominous. Right? So, it's like, wait, what was that sound? Why did it sound 8-bit? Those are the kind of things you hear when you can't see. So if we recap, we have our customer environment. We have our AWS. We have what we are supposed to protect with our storage, our environment. Think of that as our sensitive data types. Now, how do we get to a point of saying, hey, I have some unauthenticated users, as we usually do, and we have our authenticated user here in the corner trying to get to their AWS environment. And what happens when those unauthenticated users have maybe a direct approach? Maybe you spin them up and now they have a direction to go into. And that direction is straight into the AWS environment that you have. What's going to trigger to say, hey, somebody's trying to maybe access this? So let's think back to our scenario where we have a numerous amount of AWS regions spread throughout a global company of the sandwich variety. Do they have automated warning systems? Maybe they have some legacy systems that need illumination to see what they're exactly doing. Maybe they have constant alerts that are happening because they have something within their environment, but nobody's responding to it. which is causing maybe a little bit of centralized fear. And what that is basically of the variety of knowing, hey, what is the unknown? To Aries' point, it's the unknown. The things I don't know, then, hey, it's the things I need to know, right? You heard it both ways? Because that's kind of the key part of the puzzle. So as we start to get into the place of understanding of, hey, there's some unknowns. We don't know who's this trying to access our environment. Could be, the innocence of somebody who wasn't authenticated, and they're just trying to keep re-authenticating for some reason. And maybe you're trying to access it a different way. Or it could be somebody else. So how do you navigate through this cloud darkness? Because it seems like you're veering off course a bit. So how do we get to a point where we kind of wrap this around a little bit? Right? We're starting to turn the ship. And the key way for doing so is to understand from maybe a centralized viewpoint, a centralized vantage point, all these kind of things. So often we say, hey, we have identity. That plays a big factor in there. So we put the identity face up. But it's kind of in the episode. If we have something like GuardDuty, that's kind of like actively alerting to say, hey, there's something going on within the environment. There's something happening within the environment. We get to a point where, hey, we almost are there. There's a little bit more of understanding, but we're kind of a little bit off track. So how do we right size this? Well, maybe we have something that GuardDuty feeds into. And that's where something like Security Hub comes into play. Because with Security Hub, we can get to a place where we have a centralized vantage point into maybe certain standards. It could be looking for PCI or the NIST standards or AWS foundational pieces. And it's taking all these pieces of the puzzle and figuring out so that it can eventually get to a point where it triages things appropriately. And I take that as a dramatic pause and a sip of coffee, because when you think about it, this is the workflow that you are moving towards, that you're trying to understand how to implement within your environment. Because one of the things is once you have that, you start to clear up and see that the individuals who are trying to get to your environment, maybe they're a little bit further off than you thought of. And if they do try and come into your environment, maybe you have a little bit of a mechanism that goes both ways, where you have auto remediation happening. So if you have your authenticated user going through, they're good. If somebody is not good, then there's an automated step function that processes these different checks in order to, let's say, remediate those actions, right? And then eventually you get to your environment in an authenticated way where you can see, hey, this is the security posture of my organization. Now I'm at the point of saying something happened within my environment. I responded automated to my environment. Now, 3, we can work on a way in order to fix said environment. And there's a couple different pieces that you can layer on, like inspector, but that's a side quest for a different day, because we have to hit the pause game button, or as I like to call it, the good old Zach Morris timeout button, because we have to delve a little bit deeper into the scenario, into thinking about, hey, what are the things that we need the most improvement on? And I think that comes to understanding GuardDuty findings. Because do you understand the difference between a low, a medium, and a high finding within its severity? I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. I would say piece of the side quest board, but I digress. When you start to think of, hey, what is the severity classification system? How do you prioritize response efforts? And this is where it usually comes from. Are all alerts created equal? Well, when you look at something like a compromise happening within the environment, there may be multiple alerts that are generated. There might be multiple findings that come up. But now, if you have a systematic methodology of going through where, hey, high severity findings are 7 to 8.9 and medium are 4 to 6.9, and they represent different suspicious activities. You get to a point of understanding that we have something going on in the environment. But two, you also get to a point of, hey, I can take the events that came in and start to group them in together to a way that I can see the signs or the early stages of an attack that's happening within my environment, or a reconnaissance happening within my environment, or a policy violation that's happening in my environment, unusual API calls. All these things play different parts of the puzzle. So when you start to think of all these items, the way you can go about this is you recognize your GuardDuty's flows within your environment. So GuardDuty naturally categorizes everything in its structured taxonomy. Great. But you really have to dive into, hey, what is the backdoor EC2 CNC activity BDNS? What is that? And that's the piece that we want to delve into and kind of understand, because there are different finding types that come with this. And we're going to kind of skip around a little bit because, hey, if we're off the rails, we're going to continue to go off the rails a little bit. So let's remove that pause game functionality and get to a point where we have an understanding of what is next. And that what is next is to go on a quest of understanding. Yes, you can get certifications. So certificate knowledge, we'll just pop that up. But you can also go on the quest of the knowledge variety, which we like to kind of call knowledge quests. And those knowledge quests are pieces of information that keep you away from, the, let's say, the sad in the background, right? You're figuring out stuff. This is the kind of stuff that happens. But you kind of want something else to occur. So let's take the second and jump into the knowledge quest. And that knowledge quest is exactly based on today's episode. And what we want to do is we want to be I want to say understander, but no words today. I want to say you want to go into the understanding of how to navigate the fog. And usually the best way to do this is to have some type of resource that you can go to that somebody else who traversed said fog has kind of created. So what is the codex that you need in order to translate, to figure out these different pieces of the puzzle? Well, if you say you want to be a fog walker, right? You want to get to a piece of understanding, where do I start with this? And it's just that exact thing what we were delving into. And I'm working backwards from that findings piece. Because when you start to think of these different components, what you're starting to delve into is understanding how alerts are generated within GuardDuty, right? So understanding the format of A, B, C, and D. And what it exactly means is breaking down. Yes, Eric, you understood it me. All right, that's the Monday speak. So when you start to figure out those components of it, you start to think of, okay, here's a sample finding. How do I kind of go into that a little bit more and kind of delve into those exact findings, right? So kind of thing where you want to take a deeper dive. And the best way to do this is pick something and just go into it, right? Where you have finding types. Hey, exfiltration. You delve into this a little bit and you start to figure out, hey, okay, what is it? So it's marked as high. IAM identity is invoked by S3 API in a suspicious way. And the good thing about this is you're taking the Codex approach. And this is the 100. This is how you become the walker in the fog, is you have what it's doing, and then you have the remediation recommendation here. So you start to get to the part where now you know what it is. And knowing is half the battle, as they say, or they tell me. So the other half of this is getting to a part where you have this as muscle memory of delving into these different findings, especially understanding those references. Thank you, Ari. So you want to go down and just see these different impacts and understand, do you have the guardrails in place for these different items? Do you have the alerting mechanism? Do you have the run books? And one of the things that we've seen customers do is they take each piece of this, and you see the environment down there that we have, and we start to get to a part where, hey, maybe how do we take that next step? How do we get to a part where we have run books for each of these items that are, one, automated in fashion, but usually you have to start out with the manual steps, right? So taking this piece by piece, understanding the breakdown is all key components. Then the next step is leveling up a little bit. It's getting to a part where you're no longer walking in the fog. You're actively a fog hunter. You're looking and saying, hey, there's a space over there in the, if we're using the game world analogy, in the map that has some gray fog around it. I want to see what's over there. And that's the active enthusiasm that you want to have within your environment at all times. Is that a gap I see? And run towards it and figure out a way for it to be not a gap and clear up some of that fog. And that's how you actively become, that fog hunter. So a piece of that is making sure that you know how to handle multiple accounts within your AWS organization, and leveraging GuardDuty is making sure that you know how you have the administrator, the delegated admin, I should say, in order to peer into all these different accounts. Right? So that you don't have accounts within your company, your ecosystem, your environment that you don't know about, that you don't have that view into. So that's all a important part of the puzzle, right? So going down this same thought process, understanding the key terminology, figuring out, okay, what can a delegated administrator do and what does the member do? So all these are important to understand the overall workflow, because eventually you get to the part where, hey, I have to work backwards from just understanding my environment holistically. And that holistic approach is what's going to be key to being that hunter. Because when you say holistically, you also include the services that are integrated. So if you think about how leveraging something like Detective can go with, let's say, GuardDuty, well, this line right here helps you, because GuardDuty supports pivoting into Detective, because now you understand, hey, the integrations. How can you double click a little bit more into understanding what happened within the environment, especially when an incident occurs? Usually these are the tools that you would like to have at your side as an incident responder. I will channel my inner Russ and thinking about it from a TDIR standpoint. But part of it, the conversation is, if said alert happens within the environment, how do I work backwards from understanding kind of the overall radius of effect of what happened within your environment, and understanding, how do I take care of this? How do I limit this? How do I cut off access? All these key components. When in order to do so, you have to figure out, do I have GuardDuty enabled, hopefully, and then do I have it integrated with other items, right? These are all key pieces of the puzzle. The next piece of this is continuing on managing GuardDuty. Remember all those alerts? Because imagine if you have 50,000 members. Just taking that as part of the conversation. If you have 50,000 members, you want to get to a part or a point that you have everything one, automated, and two, all those alerts that are being generated, you have some type of mechanism to filter out, which ones apply to your environment, which ones do not. These are all important pieces of the puzzle. So continue on that line of thought. The best way to kind of take it to the next stage and become, let's say, an oracle is taking a step back and actually getting hands-on. And that hands-on approach is partly the approach I always suggest. Because when you start to get to a point where you have an overall AWS organization, hopefully you have that sandbox and your experimental OU within that sandbox to get to a point where you can say, hey, let us set up things. Let us have a tabletop exercise. Let us figure out if this alert triggers, so on and so forth. So the best way to go about this is kind of going to a workshop. So this workshop kind of goes into, hey, what are some of the practical techniques for web application protection? And our good old OWASP juice shop is kind of one of those items. I think this goes with the sandwich shop. I don't know if they're competing or together, but what you're kind of delving into is, how do I enable threat detection in my juice shop? And that's the key component of this, or the takeaway, I should say, is once you have your environment set up and you want to enable GuardDuty, you can do it through the console, as we mentioned. Click, 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 set up, right? These are for illustrative purposes, it says. But essentially, you want to see, hey, if something were to happen, like a SQL injection, how does this get picked up? How do you know what is happening within your environment? Those are all pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to figure out as an Oracle. And also as an Oracle, you kind of know and sense all these different items happening because you have all the GuardDuty alerts memorized because of your repetition. You figure out, hey, this is how we detected this attack. This is how we prevented this attack. And if you speak in a certain manner, now you start to get to a way of communicating with the different stakeholders that instills them with, oh, we understand the gaps within our environment. We understand how this happened within the environment. We understand how to possibly fix this in the future, right? Leveraging other services that integrate well, right? In this, it talks about using web application firewall, deploying a virtual patch, aka, hey, how can we have some rules associated in a way that helps reduce maybe the risk of bots or DDoS or something along those lines, right? So all these items are parts of the puzzle as you start to become said Oracle. What is the next step after that? Well, it's getting to a point where you understand that it's not going to be one simple fix. It's going to be multiple fixes over the length of your target state security strategy cycle. And I say it's a cycle because the documentation, the diagrams, they have to be consistently, ongoingly updated. That's one of the key components because it's not a set and forget. Your framework is going to work and continuously help you, but you want to make sure that as your environment evolves, that your overall threat detection, your overall rule sets, they evolve with it because you want to make sure that there's integrations with the most important parts. So as we spoke about in kind of our deployment of our environment, GuardDuty, there's a couple different ways. Like we had the SNS topics. We have it deploying within an AWS organization. What happens when we start to automate the entire pipeline? What happens if we use and leverage something like LZA, right? The landing zone accelerator, where you spun up the environment because we're a sandwich shop and we wanted to get the baseline foundations in with a control tower, with AWS organizations, with GuardDuty, with a delegated administrator. See kind of how all those steps happened. But to be an Oracle, you have to take that step back and look at the holistic picture of each one of those steps can be refined in such a way that you have different parts of the puzzle nailed down a little bit more each time, right? Speaking from an identity standpoint, speaking from just an incident response standpoint, how do we do so? And I think part of it is figuring out and understanding those other gaps. What are the warning signs that kind of brings that chill, the dread, the fright within your AWS stakeholders? Is it the critical alerts? Is it the unusual API activity? Is it unauthorized access? And each one of these can be correlated to your favorite scary thing. Think of maybe the static off the radio is the unusual API activity, and the footsteps are unauthorized access because you hear something, but you don't see it. You feel the alerts coming within your environment, but what's triggering them? And maybe you have the scratching sound effect as being failed attempts. But I digress, because all these are parts of the puzzle on how to create, he's going to say the thing, incident response plan for GuardDuty alerts, right? So I channel my inner Russ for a second, but creating a response workflow helps on a variety of different levels, because from IRP, you want to think about, hey, if we have GuardDuty findings, how can we optimize our resource allocation and minimize security exposure, right? So high level severity findings, they trigger that immediate response action, the immediate workflow for instant notification via, let's say, something like a pager or SMS or automatic isolation, right? Things are shut down and they're done for forensic evidence collection and analysis, right? So all this happens within maybe, let's say, 15 minutes, right? You have it isolated, you have your war room set up, you have your overarching incident from a high severity standpoint kind of triaged. Then if you think of other things like your medium severity workflow, what do I do with that? Well, that might have a different SLA. Maybe that's 2 to 4 hours. Maybe that requires just a security analyst to review, hey, there was an initial investigation and some context that needed to be gathered in order to notify the stakeholders. And of course, this is where the stakeholder is always on the beach, and that's why you have to have the response flows and backups and tabletop exercise. I digress. So when you think of a low priority, that's an interesting one too, right? What kind of level of a low priority finding do you consider actually low? That means it's part of a standard operational workflow for daily review, maybe in batches, right? Is IR person comes in, they have a batch of low priority findings that maybe is caused by a need to patch or something was updated. They have to identify the patterns, and not all low findings are created low, because you can have a low finding being generated from maybe a larger gap within the environment that just triggered a bunch of noise. And that's why it's important to have and understand your overall IRP plan. So the next step within this is making sure that everybody has their role down pat. And their role usually is, based on communication channels, escalation paths, to make sure that the right people are in the room, especially if a high alert comes into place. Do you have the correct mechanisms to go through and understand, hey, how do we notify all the stakeholders? Do we have something like an SMS topic for automated finding distribution, or do we have it going to something like a Slack or a Teams for the teams to collaborate on? That's all part of the incident response plan. And hopefully my fellow incident responser, Russ, is happy with the IRP direction, right? So it's all parts of the puzzle, right? So as we start to go through and help understand, hey, maybe an automated response would be helpful, you start to think of, hey, one of the first things we want to do is understand what our mechanisms are. And this is kind of where we start to wind down. This is where we start to think about, hey, you hear that music playing in the background, right? It kind of speeds up of, hey, I want to automate this fast. I want to get to a critical finding standpoint. It's starting to bubble up, and then it stops. Because how do I do that? So the how, it gets to a point of, remember tagging? We'll bring that back up. Resource tagging. Making sure that there's maintenance windows that are prepared. Making sure that we understand what the performance considerations are. Because if you have everything GuardDuty related getting ingested in Security Hub, and then maybe Security Hub is doing a dump, I've seen customers do, of the entire Security Hub into an S3 bucket so it can be consumed by something else. What are the time ramifications of that? What are the different pieces we have to consider? Because now you have all these different components within your environment. And we can get into kind of ad hoc querying of the GuardDuty logs and things of that nature, but automated remediation workflows. I think that's a part that you want to kind of go down, because it starts to stem a bunch of questions that ask the right individuals, hopefully, hey, how can we auto remediate this? Well, this person has to do this, and then the person, well, can we do this through a step function where we have a multi-stage workflow in order to kind of take care of whatever action? And that starts to get you to a point where you can solve your common items. And then you say, okay, we automate, maybe we just create an automated run book for some of those findings we were speaking about. Then eventually you get to a part where you're leveling up a little bit at a time, which I think is an important part of the puzzle, as I always like to say. Because every little step, every little GuardDuty finding that you kind of read about, that you kind of understand, starts to, build your XP points so you can level up yourself, but also your entire environment and the people within it. So with that being said, start off, of course, with an incident response plan, work backwards from that, but also continue the side quests, continue to go down those steps towards your goal of understanding. And maybe one day you'll clear up some of that fog that exists within your environment. Or maybe one day you can bring a friend, because it's dangerous to go alone. So take a tool, take a friend, take an understanding, or come back here next week and find out what else we can take. So on that note, a fun and happy Monday to everyone, and take care, and goodbye.